Hello everyone, today we talk about the history of the early Franks. As my regular followers know, we've been discussing Frankish history now for some time. We mostly talked about Carolingian period, the Merovingian one, and we also addressed already the history of the early Franks. I mean, the history of the Frankish people before the rise of the Merovingians. Some time ago, I had even started a series making a video for each people of the migration era, so discussing their history in relative detail. This is not going to be a continuation of that, but I will have to restart that to make videos about that series soon, because it was also kind of there were many people watching it, so it would be convenient. But today I would like to address instead this history, first of all in a more general way, but secondly and especially in perspective, especially relatively to what we have already said about the rise of the Merovingians in between the 5th and the 6th century. This is particularly important because in those videos we have stressed fundamentally the brutal and radical turn that the Merovingian dynasty carried out within the Frankish society in that time of transition, at the moment in which actually the Franks have seized what would have been eventually their Neustria, so the kingdom of Syagrius, and this more Romanized and Romance-speaking area, roughly corresponding to today's northern France, part of Belgium, etc. And we have stressed, in fact, how the Merovingians proper are something ideally distinct from the Franks, in historical perspective. Not because, of course, they were kings of the Franks and of the Frankish people. They were kind of ruling through their Frankish laws, etc. But the history, let's say the political and social balance at that point was radically transformed and shifted in a way that is, in fact, an exception within all the various Romano-Germanic kingdoms. Actually, the Merovingians did something that had never and would never happen again into a Germanic population. It was essentially creating a dynastic monarchy. That was something absurd for the Germanic mentality of the time, or at least it was something that the elites had always kind of tried to achieve, but meeting the resistance, very harsh resistance of the class of the freemen. When the Franks conquered Gaul, this changed quite a lot. It changed, actually, the history of this Germanic population changed it also in here brutally. Every single time they settled eventually into these rich and populated lands of the former former Western Roman Empire. If anything, for endemic reasons, because the Germans weren't that much. So also this idea that at a certain point the Germans arrived and started ruling with iron fists is kind of a it's just a part, half of the story. Then in order to create these kingdoms, these peoples couldn't do without the local elites. They couldn't do without their education, without their resources. So it's actually very complicated. So to give a bit of background on this transformation that the Merovingians carried out, I can address you to a couple of videos I already made. The first one is the Franks and Clovis, from Germany to Empire, which in its title is already pretty eloquent, because I wanted to stress, in fact, the differentiations between the Franks and Clovis, ideally, in terms of political culture. And this idea that, in fact, the Franks were just a Germanic population that arose to not just to create a dynastic kingdom, as we've seen, but also an empire. Because when we talk about the Frankish kingdom, we're fundamentally talking about an empire, to be honest, because the Franks had their own kingdom, but they came to subdue all these various populations that existed around, and effectively the Merovingian dynasty started to rule from these chunks that sometimes were in fact even outside the Frankish kingdom, territorially speaking. So this is something that only the Franks were able to achieve. The Carolingian Empire is not a Carolingian invention, it existed before, together also with the imperialistic vocation that the Merovingians had immediately. This is very important to stress. The Franks at this point weren't under the Merovingian rule, at all like the other Romano-Germanic kingdoms, and this was also, this was all due to thanks in relative terms, because the average Germanic freeman, or at least the aristocrats that were literally beheaded one by one by Clovis, were definitely not very happy about it. But this was due, in fact, to Clovis and only Clovis, because without Clovis we would have not had what we know as, in fact, perhaps not the Frankish kingdom, but at least the empire, and not even surely the Carolingian Empire, nothing like that. This was a very thoughtful process that the Merovingian dynasty was extremely aware of. They had a great sense of themselves. They understood what were the options now that were open to them when settling in Gaul. They perfectly understood the importance of the dynastic bond with the local elites, especially the ecclesiastical ones, but generally speaking, the Gallo-Roman elites, and also, last but not least in importance, definitely the Catholicization of the Frankish people that happened, at least formally, immediately. And that's also a pretty interesting exception, because very few of these major Romano-Germanic kingdoms passed, at least up to that point, had passed through from paganism directly to Catholicism. Catholicism means orthodoxy at this time. It's not Catholicism as we mean today, the Catholic Church, because all the others had passed through Arianism. So also the formula that Clovis used to carry out this massive transformation owed much in its success also through this very intelligent politics that he made, Christianizing immediately, according with the Catholic rite, the Franks, and therefore not creating this relative problems. And in fact, Arianism had caused, for instance, to the Goths, both in Spain and in Italy, but it's complex. Kind of every people had its own history. Just for saying that the Franks, however, went very far on average from the average of the other Romano-Germanic kingdoms. There are naturally many reasons. There are also environmental. Just think about Gaul and how it was structured, what its resources were, etc. We have been discussing this. So the Franks and Clovis from Germany to Empire, it's a very good introduction chiefly to the transformation. And another video that deals instead, with the Frankish Merovingian kingdom as such, is in fact the Frankish Merovingian kingdom, that instead highlights how this kingdom had, how the foundations of this kingdom were laid. So, and also giving an overall picture about every single aspect of the kingdom. And it's very important in there to stress the adjective Merovingian, because at that time the Franks had kind of lost their, let's say, their freedom as freemen, in fact, in political terms, compared to the Merovingians. Then, in fact, even during their decline, that brought to the Frankish kingdom to break to the Frankish Empire, to say better, to split into four, and to become, essentially just, in fact, four kingdoms, not one. The Merovingian dynasty kept its own prestige. Even the Carolingians, as you know, at a certain point extended their tutelage on the dynasty that effectively didn't count anything anymore, because by the 7th century there is no thing like a Frankish monarchy anymore. It's just these chunks but still the dynasty counted, the blood counted. This had massive influences on how Frankish politics was carried out, because what happened in the Merovingian kingdom in terms also of violence, of internecine warfare, and between the same dynasty actually is something that you don't find in any other Romano-Germanic kingdom. You don't find it this among the Goths. You don't find it among the Longobards, among the Anglo-Saxons. There is nothing like that, because at that point what had really mattered was the dynasty. And that's also, of course, even the French monarchy, that is something that effectively consolidates during the 12th and the 13th century, is something that owed much in legacy to this principle to this dynastic ideal that was not much of an ideal, was actual practice, because effectively the Merovingians had managed to wipe out all the various competitors among the Frankish nobility and establishing themselves as the sole rulers of Francia and of the Frankish people, together with the help of the church, with the with this even mystics of the monarchy that in fact would remain very prepotently and very strongly into the Frankish kingdom, especially into the Western Frankish kingdom eventually, and therefore also in the French kingdom, as it would become later into the Neustria of the Frankish or of the original Frankish kingdom. So having said this is important as an introduction. Then there are a couple of other videos. Maybe, well, you can find this easily in the playlist. There is also the one of late antique Gaul between the 5th and 6th centuries, in which I explain also the arrival of the Franks and how they dealt with local populations. There is 6th century balance of power, Goths versus Franks in Constantinople, that deals with these more international dimensions. But it's very important because even the internal affairs of the Franks kind of, in fact, brought the kingdom to pose itself towards certain directions, at least, that effectively altered pretty consistently the international politics. So here we go. Excuse me, before we go on, I drink a little bit. So, starting with the early Franks, and therefore observing this kind of Franks 1.0, because that's how it kind of started and how it went evolving, literally. So, aside from this introduction, in a more general perspective, definitely the Franks make up in history, in the history of early medieval Europe and medieval Europe in general, the a very important entity, whatever you want to call it, since kind of the early beginnings. In spite of the characteristics that we will see now, that were essentially a fragmented population, eventually recompacted under the Merovingians, but they were actually a pretty consistent group. They can be called an ethnic group, considering what ethnic meant at the time, which was mostly a political / juridical umbrella fundamentally, because the Franks were effectively Germans. So as we will see now, there is not even way at that point to say, okay, these Germans practically differed that much. They all came from the same stock, from the same cauldron, and most of the differentiations that these populations underwent was in fact when they abandoned Germany proper. Even from an archaeological point of view, it's impossible to say, okay, this find is Frankish. It doesn't make sense. I mean, if you don't use the archaeological finds are not tagged. The local material culture is pretty homogeneous all over, basically almost all over Germany. There are naturally differences, but they are very they're very difficultly ascribable, attributable to this kind of even larger ethnic groups, and it's even difficult at this point to kind of understand when such groups were born, because effectively about their origins is very difficult to know. But we're not scared, because as we will see, actually most of the times, most of the Germanic peoples that in fact we know something about in terms of the Germanic Confederation, we know something about in terms of their birth, their origin, is it's because when they entered the Roman radar at that time, this basically the only sources we have, historical sources we have, come from the Roman world. So the first knowledge of some importance on the Franks, that is actually just a name found there, are to be found in the Roman sources towards the mid-3rd century, when the Franks, just like many other Germans, had entered in contact with the empire. So they had been recognized as a political entity. Was worth of mention fundamentally into this very turbulent cauldron that 3rd century Germany had become. So as you know, the context is pretty famous. There is essentially this great period of turbulence for which the empire is under attack from several directions. The Germans had started organizing themselves into confederacies. So the confederacy was a group of several tribes that also in turn back in the day had been formed into the aggregation of several groups. It's also kind of not clear in general, because aside from how in turn these groups formed at the origin, because the Romans kind of meant these tribal entities were already formed, but towards the 3rd century, this need of aggregating into confederation was higher for the Germans, because now the whole situation was in turmoil. There were these major confederacies, also the steppe peoples, either Iranic populations or even Turkish Ugro-Finnic, let's say, populations that were pushing. So at this point, the confederation was functional chiefly for a military goal. The idea was defending the people, being stronger in numbers, also because it's not that there were many other transformations that these populations could undergo. They were fundamentally the same tribes, even from a political and social point of view, but now they were acquiring this higher form of organization that definitely had an impact also on their abilities of attacking and defending. These Germanic groups had also undergone a sensible degree of Romanization, for which they also started to not just to imitate the Romans, but actually, even serving the Romans, going not just to fight against them, but for them. So acquiring also a greater knowledge of what the empire was, also of the benefits that the Germans could have shared if they had entered into contact with, into friendly relations with the empire, or at least if they had managed to take a part of it and enjoying its benefits. And these are very complex relations that are very, alternating in terms of alliances and war. Kind of the Franks are eventually, from a historical point of view, kind of one of the best examples of this, because they were historically kind of Roman allies by definition, but they also kind of fought against the Romans on several occasions, and this tells you what, how the logics into the system worked. But by the 3rd century, the Franks were still a relatively small entity, and in fact they weren't even a actually unitary ethnic entity. They were a league of tribes formed prevalently by the Sicambri, the Bructeri, the Catti, the Cherusci, the Sali, and the Camavi, that were in fact this northwestern Germanic tribes, some of which were perfectly known. Actually, all of them were already known. Most of them were already known to the Romans since at least the 1st century A.D. Some of these tribes were the same that rose up against the Romans with the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. There were incidentally, in fact, West Germans, what are defined usually, even from an ethno-linguistical point of view, on on manuals about German philology and etc. as this western chunk of the Germans that had certain characteristics on its own, chiefly also for environmental reasons, because they inhabited this area of Germany that was the most forested, first of all, so they were developing even certain characters in terms of military. They had usually the Western Germans are the ones that, together with the very northern ones, like the ones of the Jutland and the Scandinavia, had the least cavalry of all, at least in these forested areas. And were incidentally the Germans that, as we have seen, were also in at direct contact with the Roman, were on the Roman frontier, fundamentally. So they were also the ones that more or less had this greater interaction with the Romans in many ways. Then most of the other Germans at this point were taking other routes, fundamentally. Also these Western Germans had not many other directions where to expand, fundamentally, because the greater confederations had started being built around the what would be today's northeastern Germany, Poland, the Swabian. The Swabian Confederation was kind of the largest one. It was back in the day, and that now had been crumbling fundamentally, and from which many other tribes departed, including what were called the Swabians, the Suebi, that were to settle in southwestern Germany to form the Alemannic Confederation. Those were chiefly Alp Germans, like the Longobards as well. Then there were the East Germans that also were kind of east, in territory of today's Poland, like in fact the Goths chiefly. Also the Vandals in part, the Burgundians, etc. I made some video that series I was talking to you about the protagonists of the migration era. I think I made something about the Burgundians, the Vandals, and I don't remember which other. However, you can find that in the migration era playlist if you're interested. So these other Western Germans hadn't been, they were kind of pressed between the Romans and these larger confederations. They didn't have many other many places to go. They were kind of living in areas where the empire was not very interested to expand, because the Romans had actually conquered and ruled Germany for like 20 years back in the day, having occupied in fact most of this western area, also all the Germany that was stretched from the Rhine to the Elbe River. And they had effectively underestimated these Western Germans that, however, had been conquered effectively up to the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, because they weren't actually interested to them. The Romans had been interested into Germany chiefly because of the Danubian frontier, because that's where, with the Marcomannic Confederation and other groups, the Romans were kind of more cautious, like saying if we crush those, in fact, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was happening during certain military operations the Romans were carrying out in order to destroy the Marcomannic confederations in what would be roughly today's Czech Republic, etc. Passing, like a pincer movement from Western Germany that they had effectively conquered and subdued, and where in fact the revolt broke out in the Danube. Well, also they had problems with the Illyrians and so on. But just for saying that the Romans had not given really a big much, they were not particularly interested in Western Germany in itself. If anything, their problem were mostly is kind of confederations that already existed into the eastern part and that could create effective problems to them. In fact, I would argue that the greater pressure that even during the 3rd century the empire was experiencing was on the Danubian frontier, actually not on the Rhine frontier, because these other groups were kind of even smaller tribes. They weren't in fact used to this idea of the confederation. They of course the Germans overall had this kind of leagues that had formed, that they had rebelled to the empire, even invaded part of the western areas, but it had been short-lived experiences, and now most of these Germans were kind of more sympathetic with the empire than anything. Then, of course, warfare broke out on the Rhine frontier as well. And the Franks, therefore, are born as this military alliance from all these smaller tribes that was, as we've seen, definitely already standing by the 3rd century. It's, however, possible that in the area already from the 2nd or the between the 2nd and 3rd century something had already been created, but we don't really know. So how were these confederations really built? I mean, what was the ultimate goal? We have seen the military alliance, but how did they function practically? So from the name Franchi or Franci, as you prefer, in Latin, you can draw this etymological root of the German Frank / Frei. That meant at the time, actually, Frei is today, it means free, as you understand. But free at that point had this deeper meaning that meant mostly courageous. Being free in the sense of being capable of of acting, of being a freeman in terms of being a warrior, fundamentally, and therefore someone who was proudly free, so unconstrained and capable of fighting and so on. So this was the main concern of the Franks, which was a very powerful slogan. Just remember that the confederations were at this time not really anything much identitary for the elements that made it up. The name of these confederations were, and also the sake for which these confederations were created in the first place, was an international one. So these Germans felt themselves to be still the single individual tribes, and that, so identitarily speaking, you were still, I don't know, a Catus, Camavus, or so on, whatever. But when you joined all together, internationally, you were known with this name. In fact, it's fictitious. It doesn't have any. It's conventional. Frank means, in fact, we've seen free, courageous. Doesn't mean anything else. It's like the Alemanni. Alemanni means literally all the men, as you can understand easily from the etymology. What does it mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's a conventional name. So there were naturally certain confederations that had kind of more ethnical connotations, but at that point they weren't probably even confederations proper. They were perhaps something more built up, like in the case of the Goths or the Longobards, that had in fact a kind of a common core of traditions and historical past. These confederations of the Western Germany, like the Franks or the Alemanni, were instead stressing more than those other peoples their freedom as an egalitarian system. And the reason is exactly the one we said before. That is that fundamentally they were less stratified, less cohesive groups. Therefore, they weren't used to this idea of the leadership of the monarchy. They didn't give a damn. They were kind of emerging straight from the original humans, we can say, of the Germanic world. They felt they were kind of even relatively more traditionalist, because they had undergone less political elaborations, differently from the Eastern Germans that had to cope now with massive movements also in these open grounds, in these moors that were kind of brought necessarily these confederations to unite more intensely, and therefore to develop even within them a higher level of stratification. This is particularly important especially for the ending of our video, because that's what already gives you the idea, having said what we said on the Merovingians, that what eventually Clovis carried out was particularly something particularly different from the tradition of the Frankish people in many ways, in terms of creating a dynastic monarchy. So not even a monarchy, but even a dynasty, which was completely, I mean, I can't stress enough how, for the Germanic mindset, the idea of a dynastic ruler was something outrageous. completely outside, completely untraditional, completely out of their culture. That stressed the freemanship, let's say, the freedom of the single warriors as the base of every possible imaginable Germanic society, in fact. So, in fact, for the Franks, their name had no traditional meaning. It was not an old epithet. It simply came. It was assumed conventionally in virtue of this new union of warriors, and that it was. Also, the military nature has to be stressed here, because the chief reason for which these confederations were created were military. They had to be stronger together. There was no other way. At this time, you don't have a kind of progress potential or capability of structuring your society through some kind of engineering. No, the only way you can have for being stronger is to be more cohesive, and that's it. So this is the recipe. It's not that now there are effective differences between one Germanic population or another in terms of military effectiveness because of some technical reason or kind of certain weapons that they use. The main discriminant now is how cohesive that group is from a political point of view. That's it. And this is particularly important because if you look at the Frankish people, there were no they actually lacked all the roots that were really uniting them as an entity. The Franks knew actually a very few about their own origins. Actually, and this is particularly interesting for whoever studies Germanistics and so on and deals with it. That some of kind of the most important, if not the most important chapter for studying these populations is looking at how they conceived their own origins. And the Franks had a very short memory. They didn't know about their past because they didn't have it one. They hadn't built it, traditionally speaking, with a founding myth, etc. There were not other populations that had that story in the Germanic world. They weren't. They had simply joined together. They didn't care. This gives you a lot also about their mindset, how those tribes actually lived in also in the previous centuries and so on, what their horizons were, even temporal times, and so etc. And furthermore, even at this point, when they joined into the Confederacy, they didn't manifest any particular interest in elaborating their own communitary memory, let's say. If not for what concerned the myth relative to their ruling house that instead was built later with the Merovingians, in fact. That they invented all a story that it's obviously fictional. And was stressing at that point even a certain kind of divinity, always actually in pagan terms, not really in Christian terms, because they were saying they were born out of a maritime monsters, a sea monster or something like that. The connection with water is particularly interesting, fascinating, something you find also in other Germanic populations. And they, however, for the rest, they didn't have anything like, like the Goths or the Longobards had, for which they remembered this ancient history of coming from Scandinavia that, in some cases, had been invented later, even in some of these populations. For instance, it's often said that for the Longobards, actually, we are pretty much sure that they're found in, or their myth of the origin is pretty historically acceptable, let's say. I would say reliable in historical terms. For the Goths, we think that most of their founding myth was built along the way, and mostly for the sake of being acceptable in the eyes of the Romans, that also at that point were using the gods as allies. They were kind of building a mythical past for them, using their ethnography, classical mythology, the geographical knowledge and stuff like. I mean, not classical mythology, but generally speaking, these ideas that existed into the Roman world concerning the Germans. But even there, I'm starting to believe just recently, also in here, it's been stressed too much as an hypothesis. I believe also the gods were probably more cohesive since the origins that we can't really imagine, but at least their past is very foggy, and at least their founding myth is definitely built up in many ways. But aside from this, the Franks do not have this. They didn't care. And even under this point of view, you have always to look at what is the founding myth of these populations talking about. Because there are two main sides, let's say. There is the dynastic myth and the people myth. The dynastic one, you can realize it was built by these elites, by these aristocrats who had risen to the top and wanted to create the memory of their own dynastic past. So by stressing the fact that, and recurring to divinity, because there was no other way into the Germanic world to assess by merit, by strictly, let's say, secular merit, the idea that one of them had to rule over the others as a king. Because in the Germanic world, ideally, everybody was a freeman. Doesn't matter that at this time, of course, even in these populations, there was a social stratification for which there was obviously an elite. There were major chieftains, even small kings that obviously ruled over others, and that the freemen were poorer than these guys. But the ideal was that none of these clansmen, among the other clansmen, could claim a superiority. Because the society was not stratified enough. Because these were primitive populations with a kind of an even distribution of resources, because it was at a survival rate, and there had not been a way historically to build up something like a sovereign structure, like in other civilizations had happened, and that had in fact developed monarchies, empires and divine sanctions and stuff. From the other side, you have instead the people myth. So the idea that in the into the past memory of these populations was pretty well alive. The idea that it was all the people that was created, was named, was adopted by the gods, and in this sense stress, in fact, the idea that only the leading god, usually Woden, had the lead on the people, and that there was no real king. And it's interesting because sometimes in these founding myths we find an attempt to we see that someone at a certain point tried to stress its own prerogatives as a ruling figure, especially during this time of the migration era, when the migration set in motion. So where there had to be necessarily, in order to move to be on the march, a leader that was a political and military leader at the same time. But there were different interpretations of how this leadership was conceived, because from one side you had, the Germans had always elected their military leaders. It's something that to rule them during war. It's something that it's first of all very functional. It's kind of evident in any Indo-European context where there were definitely always some figures that were put at the lead chiefly for military reasons, because otherwise you can't command effectively. If you don't cede power, you can't command. There is no way out. It's very simple, actually. But when the hostilities were over, these powers were given back to the people. So when war was over, nobody was authorized, legitimized to rule over the populations. Well, during the migration era, the military function was actually non-stop, because the situation was so messed up all around internationally. You had always be on your guard, and having an effective rule. And therefore, over time, certain elites had tried to effectively seize power with the excuse of this military function, and stratifying even in the memory of this population. There might have been otherwise very traditionally egalitarian this idea that at a certain point there had been a king. Then maybe the thing was reversed. This is typical of certain populations, like even the Longobards that had something like that. You know, in the moment of greatest difficulty, they had kind of necessitated these figures. Or maybe there is also the Hunnic period. The Germans at a point are all conquered by the Huns, and the Huns, just like the Romans, tried to let's say to compact all these various smaller chieftains into something, you know, under a greater, higher ruler, fundamentally, because they were easier to control in this sense. So even the Hunnic domination brought this steps model in, where there was effectively a warlord that had to rule all the others. Then when the Hunnic Empire vanished, there was, in a certain sense, a coming back of the people, a coming back of the freemen, that the delegitimized the ruling class at that point that had served with the Huns, and coming back to this freedom, original freedom. So in the case of the Franks, this is the point. This was particularly intense because the Franks, first of all, were also relatively to the Huns, now that we have named, they were kind of also relatively detached. The Franks, now we will see, were fundamentally expanding across the Rhine. So they were, like other populations like the Burgundians, a bit inside the Germanic world and a bit outside of it. A bit from the Germanic / Hunnic side and the Roman side. So they even had more options to play. And the various, like, the Huns or the Romans had different, they were kind of more careful and less incisive on them, incisive on them because of they were in a frontier area, so in areas that were even more difficult to control for them, and therefore they had more to entice them and than threatening them, even though these were fundamentally the double edges of the same sword in many ways. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So as we were saying before, even archaeology doesn't show us, at least up to this very day, these chances of identifying, of finding out something more about the origins of the Frankish Confederacy. In fact, for the lack of homogeneity in the Frankish cultural traits, especially in this very first phase. So there is basically no way to add new elements, new and distinctive elements compared to the written sources. It is true that archaeology can show us really a lot of new things, and that mostly for this time in history we have to rely on archaeology for knowing something new. But as we were saying before, archaeology doesn't explain a great much. Archaeology just shows definitely certain aspects of material culture. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you can try to reconstruct a broader understanding of how, the wealth distribution, etc. But the data are scanty. You don't effectively, it's even difficult to date a certain find. We don't actually know much about what was happening there. We don't have a clear picture of who was who there in Germany, in the cauldron. So actually the most important sources that we will ever have relatively to this period, at least given the amount of elements that archaeology can find potentially up to this point, is definitely the written sources. it's historiography, and this is brutally underestimated because now I don't want to open a digression and criticism on how history is perceived and studied, and how also archaeology has, some leading, the way these researches are carried out are sometimes interested. They're oriented, and they try to stress their own importance, actually saying, okay, well, we are the real ones because we have the actual find, while history is just a story invented. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. There are kind of real interests. We're talking about Monet, why even this perspective is stressed. In my opinion, I'm a great conservative, definitely, in this regard, because I believe that actually, like, the shamefully underestimated and overlooked informations, the most reliable informations we have are from historiography. You have to look at the old sources. You have to know how to translate from Greek. You know how to know how to translate from Latin. That is the pool from which we get the best information. So they're never actually, they're not fantasy. I mean, even when they are fantasy, they still tell you a lot about that world, because you can understand why they recur to fantasy at one point, and with which basis, or through which aims. And these are, studying those sources reveals you a lot about that world. And effectively, all the archaeological data that we have at our disposal today means almost nothing without the historiographical knowledge, because without that one you can't even say vus vu. I mean, the fact that a group, for instance, was situated in a certain point in the Barbaricum is something you can't tell from archaeology. You can't try to say, okay, yeah, here perhaps there was a group from a certain time to another, very vaguely, but then you can't even understand whether they moved, whether they melted with the local population, whether there was some other change. Because if you don't know that the Roman sources tell us that there was a people there at that point, you can't even say who they were, these guys. So go back to the written history, because that's really the key. That's really the answer. It has its own limits. It doesn't tell us everything, but it definitely tells us way more than what archaeology can do in terms of, without that historiography. With all the huge respect that I actually have towards archaeologists and archaeology in itself, because sometimes what we find, archaeologically speaking, is really amazing. But when it gets to certain dimensions of this historical past, you can't do without historiography, because that's literally the only way you can tell who was who, or at least you have to, that can give you an idea about who they thought at the time who was who. Because we also have this dramatic problem that when defining the identity of these confederations, we actually look, in fact, still from a Roman perspective. I mean, the same problem of the fact that these Germans didn't write. The Germans didn't write. So what the hell do we know what they were thinking? It's just the Romans who tell us eventually what they were. And even when the Germans wrote down their history, they were doing it through, in fact, a Romanized perspective, because they had learned to write from the Romans. They had settled into a land that now they ruled, that was effectively a Roman land. In fact, that this is kind of there are kind of pros and cons. Because indeed, in this way, we know much less about peoples like the Thuringians or the Saxons, because they remained in Germany. They weren't relatively untouched by Romanization, and we don't know nothing. Sometimes it's even it's kind of better, because another dramatic aspect is that when the Germans fully Christianized, they stopped burying their dead with objects, fundamentally, aside from Christian, really very poor religious I mean, relatively poor religious, you know, how do you say it in English? The trousseau, whatever. You can't. So it's beautiful because instead those peoples who remained outside the Christian world kind of kept burying their dead with weapons, with trousseaus, with very rich burials for a longer time. So incidentally, about material culture, we know more about that side, etc. But I think historiography still beats, definitely, in terms of amount of knowledge and understanding about those populations, archaeology, because it's definitely a way more, it's a much wider and much more refined tool, because just remember that whoever wrote history in the past did it for answering the same questions that we're posing ourselves today. We have to be honest about this. There is this prejudice that is very much present, in fact, in a certain area of the world. I don't want to say which one, but it's pretty evident. If even modern historiographies are influenced about this. If you come from a country that up to, the 6th, the 7th century didn't have a written tradition on its own, but obviously you're stressing that the archaeological data is more important tendentially as an historiographical tendency, because you believe from your own perspective that that's what's important. If you come from a country where chronicles are all written by monarchs who commissioned them, and you obviously have a distrust towards the reliability of chronicles in terms of truth. If you come from a world where instead the chronicles were written by common people who had kind of a more even a direct look and a greater to reality, etc., you're prone to be way more open to believe those sources are way more reliable, because they effectively are. So we should go past these prejudices about, especially the written history, and not dismissing it, especially also for this time, saying, oh no, that's narrative, that's a history, that's someone who wrote it, who made it up, who just wanted to mislead us. No, because I believe that everybody who has actually studied sources from the migration era, historiography from the migration era, perfectly knows that their contemporary historiography is extremely deep, extremely rich, extremely thoughtful, extremely intelligent. Really intelligent. Never think that you are never think the stupid, childish sense of superiority that you are more intelligent than a person who lived in the 6th century. You are not. Just be aware of it. You are not. Okay? So the way we dismiss sometimes our historical past it's disgusting, to say the least, and we should really go back to sources, knowing how to read, how to translate, because frankly, in fact, just like the Franks would say, in the true etymological sense of the courageously, I don't see any possible future for us if we keep, look at history just like a, mathematical equation. Like only objects matter, and nobody reads anymore, and we make just quantitative and not qualitative research, because sometimes even studies from these times work a bit like this, especially some archaeological ones. Now there is the fashion of putting, but in many other, also historians do this all the time now, to make this large to create these large teams who bring in, a huge amount of sources and try to use programs and stuff like that to calculate all the statistics and stuff. What kind of historical research is that exactly? How do you think a machine is gonna ever be able to have the same level of criticism and understanding of a human mind? How do you think history can be? I mean, here I'm not putting a limit to the to the capabilities of technology. Here I'm simply saying that at this time, at this stage in history, it's very stupid, to say the least, to pretend that a machine can explain history to you without any understanding of your own, any effort on your own, any criticism of your own. And especially now, where you can access literally all the sources, especially from this period here, because they're all published, they're all there. So everybody, what before someone had to do for all his life, moving from library to library, finding books, etc. Now it's something you can do freely from your computer at home. And you don't do it, then you are stupid. You are really stupid. That's the real point. Forgive me for the vent, but this is really what we're heading to. So my advice is, do not fall in the trap and stay intelligent, stay on the sources, learn how to develop a autonomous criticism, because without it we are lost as a civilization in the first place. However, going back to the Franks, what concerns the Frankish relations with the empire also is pretty foggy to us, because we also in here we don't really know how the first contacts with the Romans began. As we were saying before, the Franks rose to be some of the best allies of Rome in the Gallic region, and yet we don't seem to we don't actually understand what the first contacts, with the first interactions were. And one of the main reasons, because obviously we know more or less what the Romans dealt like with these populations, but the problem is we don't know at this point the Franks what they were up to. And this actually leads us to suggest that the Frankish Confederacy didn't have quite well-defined or precise strategies towards the empire. Actually, during the second half of the 3rd century, together with other group of Germans, the Franks started to carry out this series of raids against the empire. Let's say the most memorable one for incisiveness was the one carried out during the years 274-275 AD. So in this moment of distress of the empire, this was the moment in which the empire was legitimately being fixed. You know that before Diocletian, it's Aurelian that really puts the empire together. I mean, literally. And the Roman Empire could effectively fall in the 3rd century. I'm not kidding. It was perfectly possible. Aurelianus, or Aurelian, as you want to call it, definitely was the figure that into these years, in fact, these very years between 270 275, gave back to the empire that political and military unity for which he was eventually recalled as restitutor orbis, so the one who effectively put once again the world all together, because that's how the Romans also conceived their own empire, and they were right. They effectively at that time Rome ruled over the world, because even given their geographical knowledge, that's how they saw it. So the Franks in this moment of greater trouble for the empire had, like many other Germans, exploited the situation to carry out their raids and so on. So, but for the rest, we don't really... And you see that we are already kind of late in time, the end of the 3rd century. By the end of the 3rd century, certain confederacies are already definitely... I mean, not really formed, but they're we know much. We know something more about them, more or less, or at least they were more formed. Here, the Franks were still kind of fluid in many ways, and also raids were, led with a general contingent strategy. They didn't belong to any kind of higher grand strategy for which the Franks were projected. No, because they were scattered. They were still acting effectively as different tribes, each one on their own. Consider that the area covered by the Franks, so chiefly in this area in the northwest Germany between the Rhine and the Weser rivers was relatively large. So there were several, and also kind of geographically compounded. So there were definitely very relatively deep differences within the same tribes that made up the Frankish confederacy. So how were these Franks? I mean, that we deal also with military aspects of the Frankish, of the migration era. I will definitely make a video in the future about the the Frankish army at this time and their tactics and equipment and so on. But as I often say also when I start those videos, it's not that there was a great difference. Actually, there wasn't any difference at all if you really look at the data available between the way these Germanic tribes fought. Our Enlightenment influence mentality needs us to draw categories between these populations, saying okay, let's find mostly the distinguishing factor, but in strictly military historical terms, it's better actually to do the exact opposite. I mean, to stress the fact that there weren't at all substantial differences between the various. There is this legend that also influences a little bit the thing that the Franks were known like this because of the Franziska, so this throwing axe that could be used also as a normal axe, of course, that allegedly characterized and identified the Franks as a national weapon. Well, this is false. Actually, the throwing axe, the same type the Franks used, was used by literally every single Germanic people. I mean, there was not even one that didn't use this weapon. So that's false. For instance, then we know that the Franks had the Angons as well. Yeah, okay, but the Angons were known. Also the Alemanni used. Also other populations used them, and that the Angon is fundamentally the Germanic response to the Roman pilum that had effectively actually the same degree of penetrability of a Roman pilum at this point. So at this point, what is mostly interesting is the degree of Romanization of the Germans. As we were saying before, the migration era brought progressively through wars, slaughters, enslavements, etc., to a greater stratification of the same Germanic people. So now, effectively, the Germans of the 3rd century were different from the Germans of the time of Augustus. The time of Augustus, they were literally primitives with clubs. Is that whether they lacked metals, they didn't know how to they didn't have enough resources in order to extract them, etc. But by the 3rd century, it's not that even here things had changed enormously, but at least the Germanic elites now were consistently were wearing an equipment that was perfectly similar to the Roman one. Actually, as you know, the Roman legionnaire and at least the Germanic elite, because most of the Germanic troops were unarmored, and also increasingly more Roman troops were growing unarmored, were pretty much identical. I mean, they were using literally the same weapons. They were incidentally mostly Celtic weapons, both for the Germans and the Romans. And therefore, they also were a pretty, a tactical challenge for the Romans. I mean, the Roman army, especially in the 4th century, with the Constantinian reforms, was perfectly able to cope now with these more aggressive confederacies. But the Alemanni were, for instance, were an enemy to be reckoned with. I mean, the Germanic charges were renowned effectively for their, their fury, their effectiveness, their strength, and they were pretty dangerous in open field. So here we are in the presence of populations that were kind of knowing how to organize themselves better and how to cooperate with the Romans. As you know, since the Romans and the Germans met, the Romans had started employing German, let's call them soldiers at this point, not to be more specific, because some of them were auxiliaries, other mercenaries. I made some videos about this already. If you're interested, you can go look at the Summacari that were, in fact, at the beginning of the 3rd century under Caracalla. That talks incidentally about this the same period in the Germans and how they were hired in the Roman army, etc. And especially these new foreign entities. I mean, during the 3rd century, Rome wasn't just absorbing auxiliaries in terms of foreign. I mean, populations that Rome had effectively subdued and by conquering their lands, that now they were Romanizing through military service, making them fighting as auxiliaries in permanent units. But by the 3rd century onwards, there is this new kind of freelance hiring of foreigners from outside the Roman borders. That was sometimes way more effective, and it also tells you how the same Germanic world was changing, because now mercenarism was popping out, and mercenarism usually is an indicator both of kind of a transformation, kind of an evolution of society, but at the same time a kind of social stratification, also increasing of endemic warfare and so on. So these are all the dynamics that are changing now the Germanic world. The Franks are within this as well. And what is particularly interesting, and maybe another characteristics that we hinted at also before, is that the Western Germans were known for having usually less cavalry than Eastern Germans, which is kind of normal, because as we've seen with those rivers and heavily forested areas of Western Germany, also certain relief and so on, the cavalry wasn't that good. There were other areas of frontier, surely along the Rhine and etc., that also previously to Roman conquest in the Celtic world had kind of specialized into cavalry warfare. Seemingly, the Treveri cavalry was pretty strong. Incidentally, the Treveri were this Celto-Germanic population that lived across the river Rhine. In fact, the name Treveri seems to mean, etymologically speaking, those who live across the river. And these were, with Trier, Augusta Treverorum, the same region where the Franks were to settle eventually, but they came from the forest, so they were just to come here, and they probably made way less use of cavalry, which is kind of ironic, because the Franks were to develop by the 8th century kind of the strongest cavalry in the West. But even at that time, they still recognized that back in the day, into this migration era, there were other Germanic populations that were way better than them as cavalrymen. This is particularly fascinating. They said the Goths and the Longobards were better cavalrymen as them in the 8th century, while actually now the Frankish cavalry had surpassed the cavalry of these peoples because of Romanization, of sedentarization, etc. Chiefly of sedentarization, of course, but they still used cavalry, of course. So, like all the other Germans, were now kind of dwelling in other areas that were more like flatlands, moors, they also moved faster. They entered in contact with these horse-riding peoples of the steppes of Iranic or Ugro-Finnic stock. They absorbed part of their refugees when they were fleeing the Hunnic invasions. So yeah, they kind of got this kind of more Reitervölker character, horse riding peoples, etc. While the Western Germans remained effectively, also the Anglo-Saxons, etc., seemingly had very few and cavalry and transitively also less collectively trained and also therefore less lesser quality cavalry in general. But in general, at this time, the main arm of the Germans was still infantry. Cavalry had been developing, massively during the migration era, but it was still infantry at that time in the world that made the difference on the battlefields, and it would made it for many centuries. And actually, during the medieval times, the centuries in which cavalry fully dominated the battlefields was like 1 century, 1.5, maybe 2, depending on the areas actually, because it remained the prevalent arm at one point, especially from the Carolingian. Can't talk about reforms, but the development of it. But infantry could be effectively used against cavalry for most of the Middle Ages. What is instead particularly fascinating, aside from the tactical side, is in fact the strategical side, because the Franks at this point were not just land warriors, but they also fought on waters. And this is something very fascinating that I like to recall all the time, is that the Franks were also great sailors. This time was a bit like the Viking Age, if you want. Effectively, these were Germanic populations who took the sea, who were exploiting the weakness of a great continental empire. So they were doing essentially the same thing. You find at this time in the 3rd century Frankish piracy in the Black Sea, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Asia Minor. I mean, these warriors traveled far and wide, sometimes raiding the empire, sometimes fighting for the empire, and you could find them literally everywhere. So this gives you also a dimension of the permeability of the frontiers of the time, of the possibility of going out there to make money as a mercenary. And on ships, so the Franks had at least some of them were facing the North Sea, and that's also through the Rhine, actually, because the Rhine was also this major waterway at the time, since centuries, and they took the sea and they went raining along. Frankish piracy was something the Roman authorities had relatively serious problems to cope with. This piracy disappears, as always happens over time, when the empire regains strength, especially with the rise of Diocletian and Constantine, and let's say up to at least the mid of the 4th century, things are kind of still under control for the Romans once again. But nevertheless, it's very fascinating that the Franks had this maritime vocation. In fact, I don't know whether it's directly connected, but it's possible is that the myth of the Merovingian dynasty, the origins of the Merovingian dynasty, actually stated that they descended by a maritime monster. Now, I don't know whether, because the Germans actually in their mythology, this is pretty unknown, that they were actually they had this past memory of the fact they had come across the sea from Scandinavia, that they looked at water as this primitive origin of life. In part, the water was sometimes even a sacred element. And the Franks had dwelt relatively close to water, to the sea, so they definitely had the excuse me, I was reading something now, but just for saying that they had this maritime deities and so on. So these maritime monsters like dragons slash snakes, etc. Well, the founder of the Merovingian dynasty was thought to be in the legend as kind of half maritime monster and half human. So this was definitely a kind of a totemic belief that was also pretty common among other peoples, other tribes. But it's important because what we were saying before, because it doesn't have to be given for granted. When you find this idea of the ancestor to be half animal slash monster and half human, it means that there was something divine in his origin, and this was a way to stress the prerogatives of a dynasty, not of a people. This is the case of the Merovingians, and this is probably something made up kind of later, so by the same Merovingians. So of course, not just because it's kind of doubtful that that the Merovingians descended from maritime monsters, but also because, in fact, probably at that time they hadn't even thought that, you know, those very chieftains that were supposed to descend from, they hadn't thought that they would have risen to become a ruling dynasty of a kingdom. It was something that probably they couldn't even conceive still back in the generations at that time. To eventually, you know, create at that time as a story, as a founding, as a totemic origin. And so the Franks effectively, it's interesting. The Frankish piracy hit sailing along the coasts, either through sea or through rivers. It's very interesting because that's what the Vikings were to do some century afterwards. Is kind of interesting. And as we were saying, there is this other phase of normalization of the Roman Empire in the first half of the 4th century, where more or less the situation also in the frontiers is more contained. So also the Germanic populations keep moving and threatening the borders and trying to push in, but the Romans kind of are able to contain them and also partly to settle them as peasants and being able still to Romanize them. Things get out of hand mostly after the Battle of Adrianople, where literally a unique autonomous people that are the Visigoths are entering as an entity within the Roman Empire and kind of ruling themselves on their own and being used by the Romans, being sent here and there also as mercenaries to fight. The Visigoths paid a very high tribute of blood in the Roman service as well, and the Franks also get a little bit normalized at this point. So in this decades, the Romans, as we know, started to settle new colonies of German prisoners, especially along the Limes, as peasants or sometimes also as soldiers, because now the main problem for the Romans after the great crisis of the 3rd century was not just a strictly economic one, so they needed people to work the land to produce agricultural goods, but effectively also a academic one. There was a problem literally of finding the records for the army, and therefore settling these peoples that were all still pretty warlike, traditionally speaking, was, at least in the first generations, also a very effective way to provide kind of military men for the army. So at this point, Rome still manages the migration fluxes. They're able to catalyze them, to absorb them, and to use these forces effectively to Romanize them. And among these peasants slash soldiers, now there were lots of Franks as well, that in various ways started to settle into northern Gaul. So in this area of Gallia Belgica, that they were eventually in a couple of centuries to form their kingdom on their own. Because if you really look at from the map, Frankish Neustria was effectively the ancient Belgic province of the Roman Empire. So in the same period, we have also, in fact, a not very surprising at this point, infiltration of the Franks into the Roman army. So there were lots of Frankish elements in the Roman army in the West, especially, and they and already by the 4th century they started also obtaining very relatively high ranks. You know that the Roman military had a consistently meritocratic system of promotions. At least who was an effective commander was kind of had options to rise through the ranks. And at this time, I really despise when people say, oh no, the Roman army was getting Germanized. It was completely the other way around. As long as a Roman state stood on its feet, there was a Roman army, and the Roman army was, first of all, the most efficient military of the world, still at this time, and it's not the Roman army was getting Germanized. The word Germans got Romanized through the Roman army. This is often overlooked. It doesn't make a freaking sense to talk about Germanization of the Roman army as long as there wasn't a Roman army, because as long as there was a Roman army, that was Roman. It was not of any other thing, aside from the fact that there were many other nationalities that participated to the Roman army at this point as individual soldiers. But the Roman army was the most powerful Romanizer ever built, ever conceived. At this time, the empire was the army, legitimately. Actually, during the 4th century, you know that the Roman armies, the Roman Empire starts developing also a greater bureaucracy, etc. But there's still no comparison in terms of expenses. The Roman military is effectively what all the Roman states revolves around in terms of resources to be spent, etc. And it's the Roman army is the most efficient component of the Roman state. So this always worked excellently, and it was a great opportunity for a German to enter into the Roman army, to make a career. And we know we're plenty of evidence actually of Germans who were born in Germany proper that went into the Roman army, to the Roman Empire, to hire into the Roman army. They spent their, how many was it, 30 years of 25 years of service, and then what did they do? Sometimes they could remain in the empire, definitely, but sometimes they went back wherever they came from, and they spent the rest of their lives back in Germany. We know it in Denmark. It's plenty of Roman flights, of these Germanic auxiliaries who proudly stated into a place like Denmark that they had served Rome. They were freaking proud of that. And they were Roman soldiers, as well as they had been Roman soldiers, as well as Germans. This is very difficult for us to understand today, because we have to create this positive model of the Romans versus the Germans, but at the time it wasn't anything like that. There was never this dichotomy. Of course, the Germans thought they were kind of better than the Romans, because the Germans never felt to be inferior to the Romans. They perfectly knew what the Romans were capable of. They hugely admired them. They were morbidly fascinated with the especially the idea of the empire. because in this pagan world they saw the empire as the divine glory that had chosen the Romans, and that's why they were extremely proud when they came to rule over lands that were given that had been formerly Roman, because now they thought that the divine glory had instead crowned them. This is also part of what the Merovingians were in their imperialistic ambitions were fueled by in many ways. But generally speaking, the Germans specifically, so these Central European populations that had dwelled for centuries at the outskirts of the empire and perfectly knew the empire at this point, way more than the Romans knew about them in some way, didn't want to destroy the empire. They didn't have any reason to destroy it. Are you nuts? What do you destroy the empire for? You can go there to work. You can settle in there. You can get the recognition from this universal empire. You can share their benefits. You can start living their own way. And that's what literally they did. So also the catastrophic fall of the Western Roman Empire, like Gibbon described it, it's obviously a pile of bollocks, first of all, but just it came apart not because there was an active destruction, but because it simply melted away. Because at that point the problem was within the Roman state. The Germans actually settled into areas, definitely using force as well. I mean, and this doesn't mean to dismiss the fact that there was a violent conquest. But this came because that was the normal dialectics of the time. I mean, it's not that the Romans had been so different in that, and nobody did in a different way, but there was a consistent, this is, macroscopically evident to anyone who knows the history of Romano-Germanic relations, that there was a consistent part of the Germans that definitely was helping the empire. They were federati of the empire, and among these, definitely the Franks. In fact, at the beginning of the 5th century, oh my god, of the 5th century, the Franks are, as we've seen, have expanded fundamentally. They have started coming out a little bit from the forests. They have crossed the Rhine, have been settled in there by the Romans, and therefore they are being stabilized by the Romans into northern, kind of strictly geographically speaking, also partly in central Gaul, as federati of the empire. Federati means simply allies. It comes from the Latin word fedus or foedus, as you want to call it. It means alliance. In the Byzantine sources in Greek, sometimes you find like summakoi, which means friends/allies. It's the same exact thing. I think federati and summakoi are equivalent at this time. So, and this time, remember that by the 5th century, the Roman Empire is effectively split into these two administrative halves of East and West. So things are starting to be managed also differently in the two halves. And as you know, in the western half, the Germans have a greater effect, especially after the year 406. The Franks are, the Franks are actually allies of the Romans. What happens is that the Alans, the Vandals, these other groups that start to move in and are that they break the Roman frontier. They pass in 406, and the Franks are like there, and technically speaking, they're settled on the frontier to stop those other peoples, the Swabians, the Vandals, the Alans, as we say, and they don't. I mean, they actually try, but they're alone. They can't make it because the Romans are literally out of there. There was no one to stop them. In 410, the Romans also abandoned Britain. If I'm not wrong, it was 410. So this kind of area, northwestern Europe, is being left kind of on its own. So what the Franks do, observing these other populations, these Sarmato-Germanic populations invading Gaul, they say, okay, you know what, let's seize some land for ourselves as well. So they progressively also expand formally still as federati of the Romans within the same Roman territory. The Frankish people at this time is probably, as we've said, not very cohesive in itself. And what is extraordinary is that within the Confederacy there are actually, and probably more than actually, several different kingdoms and other groupings. Yes, because you have to understand what the kingdom is in here. The kingdom is not the kingdom that is going like the Romano-Germanic kingdoms that formed at the end of the story, with, you know, these bigger chunks of Europe that are ruled by one people that has, namely, one king, etc. The Germanic kingship at this time was something much smaller. It was fundamentally, there were chieftains, there were local chieftains that they took the Latin name of reges, you know, for the plural of rex, that is king, in fact. We say the Latin term because that's how we know it, because it's the Romans were describing this to us, and these reges were fundamentally just small kings. So there were chieftains who were kind of clan leaders and or sovereign clan rulers, and they have definitely a capability of direction of their clienteles, of their clans, etc. And the main problem with confederacies like this is that they effectively didn't have a univoque, a unique political line, because every king did whatever he was pleased by. So there was definitely also a lot of competition within the same Frankish people, and there was also definitely a problem of managing these people from the outside. Given that these were Roman federati, the problem is what do you know, if you are the Roman government, what do you talk with exactly? We know the Romans negotiated fundamentally with all the single kings, because that was practically the only way to make it. It's not that they it was the only thing to do, because effective power was detained by these smaller kings. We see it also in, I don't know, with the Alaman, with our populations, where, and this is particularly important to understand, because there is no such thing at this point like a Frankish king that rules all over the people. It would have been political fantasy at this time for the same Germans. That would made no sense. These were born as tribesmen, as clansmen. They had all their own chieftains. They're all communities. What was the idea of a sovereign kingship? It was absurd. It was against the freedom. It was against the egalitarian traditions. It didn't make sense. Always given that, of course, the various kings tried always to, you know, seize more power, which is also kind of a constant in history, and they tried to knock out the others. And effectively, the rise of the Merovingians happened exactly like this, because Clovis wiped out literally every single other opponent within this Frankish aristocracy, and that's how effectively he rose as the sole ruler of the Frankish people. Naturally, with great distress of many that not only, you know, opposed him, but in fact were killed because of this. Just think, this naturally was also told in poetical terms. Think about the vase of Soissons, the story. We can tell it later if you like. But it was a very brutal transformation, eventually, from a world that didn't absolutely like anything like that. So the the Romans also weren't particularly gentle souls, as we all know, and at a certain point they get fed up with the charades of the Franks, because they were unruly and they couldn't be effectively controlled. And we know that in the year 440, or maybe just a few years afterwards, we don't really know, the Romans crush the Franks at the Battle of Vicus Helena, that is close to the today's French city of Arras. The imperial army crushes this Frankish leader, and this is, we have a very, from the sources, we have a very few information about the whole thing. But we have to think that even relatively small clashes like this were extremely important to reverse the balance of these political entities that weren't that, united, but not even very consistent. So what we record just, as Aetius, actually, because it was him, together with Majoranus, the future emperor, who fought also against the Visigoths, subduing them, and with the Vandals actually being defeated at that point. Destroyed this Frankish. It was a big thing for the Franks. So this little event actually probably had great effects locally speaking. Just remember all the time that when we talk about the so-called barbarian invasions and this terrible thing, you don't have to think the Germans as that they were dwelling particularly well this time. The Romans had settled the Franks in areas that were completely depopulated, that were poor, underdeveloped, ruining. The Franks were, there was a problem feeding people. Think about even the agricultural potential was pretty low. They were consistently struggling. And there was a demic problem as well, because how many were these people? We don't really know, but if you look at, peoples like the Visigoths, about which we know a little bit much, this time they were just the warriors were at best like a couple of tens of thousands. It's not that they were that much. In one battle you could be wiped away. So the Battle of Vicus Helena, as a Roman victory, is very meaningful and probably orientates the Franks more on the pro-Roman side. This is particularly important because it's these relations were quite fluid. We've seen it on the video. This balance was quite fluid. It was mostly an internal matter. You have to think. We've seen it especially in the video on the Burgundians that had a similar history, that were settled on the Rhine. Then they get destroyed by the Huns or by the Romans, because we don't really know, and they're resettled by the Romans into what would become Burgundia. So even in there you find, especially these peoples that dwelt along the frontier proper between the Romans and the Huns, that they were trying to exploit this middle ground. It was, however, extremely dangerous as well, but it was consistently the only way to survive as an independent people, at least as an autonomous people in that context. So we have to think among these Germanic populations always a side that was kind of pro-Roman and one that was I say pro-German meant in a traditionalist sense. And this was a struggle that even in the Frankish world was pretty strong. Because these are the time in which the same father of Clovis was fighting actually for the Romans. The father of Clovis was he served the Roman army for many years, and he was evidently from the pro-Roman side, even though we don't have to think it like that they were in love with the Romans. Of course they couldn't see each other, but the problem was what was more convenient for the people at that time. The father of Clovis embodied that party, whereas Clovis' mother who was Thuringian, by the way, and therefore this witnesses the connections that still existed between the most Romanized Germans and the ones who still lived into the Barbaricum in a completely non-Romanized fashion, that instead was in fact the traditionalist side of the Germans. At this time, eventually, the Thuringians were, well, actually later, were siding with the Goths in Italy, because the Franks, after Clovis, were expanding even against, into Germany back once again, and there was this. Well, now it's complicated to explain, but in that video on the 6th century balance of powers between the Franks, Byzantines, and Goths, I explained it, I think, in detail, decently enough. We're still, choosing which direction to take. This is also a very particular moment in history, because the western half of the empire is effectively it's not truly crumbling, because up to Majorianus, let's be honest, the Western Empire could well survive. It was I really don't understand people who say, "Oh no, the Western Empire had to fall," yeah, because it was doomed all this time. No, it wasn't. To tell it plain and simple, it would have been enough for the Byzantine to, West and East to annihilate the Vandalic kingdom. You can sure bet that by the Arab invasions, there would have been still a Western Roman Empire standing there. So history can't be explained so deterministically. But it definitely there was the perception that the empire, at least into Gaul, that had been, by the way, one of the most central and Romanized lands of the empire, was not present. You couldn't reach there. Now the empire, but the mid 5th century is basically Italy once again. And excuse me, the resources that the Italian peninsula can from Ravenna can mount. Excuse me, I drank a little once again. So there was this idea of what to do. I mean, how to deal with the empire. Of course, now the Franks were expanding into the north, but still the problem was, there is formally a Roman government in here. There is even a Roman army. The same, in fact, that defeated the Franks at Vicus Helena in 440, or right around there. And at the same time, what to do? I mean, how to pose ourselves with Ravenna, with Constantinople, with this general balance? Will the Romans be able to recover this western region? Many options were open. At this time, the main problem actually was the Huns, was Attila, which is actually the correct pronunciation. I've heard the worst, terrible, imaginable, all the pronunciation. Attila is pronounced Attila, not Attila, not I think it's Attila, and this was also a big problem, because effectively the Germans, if you look at it from the Frankish perspective now, they were pushed from the east, because the Huns could effectively mount up expeditions and raid deep into Gaul and to make a freaking mess. So now the Franks were in trouble, and they side with the Romans. It's very interesting that after the Battle of Vicus Helena, magically, I wouldn't say it's not a coincidence, around there was an enclave of Frankish federati that was constituted around the city of Tournai. So this is what normally happened: is that when the Romans crushed a Germanic army, they didn't wipe it out, because they knew that they could use it as a political pawn. So they settle it, and they use them as a buffer state against other powers. And they this is where, from this enclave, that in fact also the Merovingians would start building there were other smaller kingdoms, in fact, that were built around the same system, especially in around the important Roman city of Augusta Treverorum, today's Trier, in Germany, and in the Rhineland. Just remember that today's Germany is, as you know, the border between France and Germany is not the Rhine. So this area of the westernmost area of Germany would be what at the time, I mean, across the Rhine was the Gallia proper, the Belgic Gaul. And this is where the Romans settled the Franks, and that's a very important area strategically speaking, because from Trier, from Augusta Treverorum, the Romans had ruled that was the prefecture of the Gauls, from which the Romans had ruled literally from Scotland to Morocco. That was had been the most important military and center of the West. Now it passes to the Franks. Naturally, this area has sensibly, ruined. In fact, the Romans have shifted the prefecture of Gauls to Arelate in southern Gaul, into the Rhone valley that is kind of more secure, surrounded by mountains. It's closer to Italy, and so. But the Rhineland enters into Frankish control at this point. So now the Franks are really the ones that the Romans are able to stem, to control, and to put at the frontiers, to exposed to the Huns and other populations that were traditionally not very friendly with them, chiefly the Alemanni. The Alemanni also had been Roman federati, but they had a completely different mindset. Probably not so much at the beginning, but eventually the Franks rose to be the friends of Rome and the Alemanni the enemies of Rome, and they were neighbors, so they didn't like each other very much. The Franks eventually were the supporters of Romanism in some way, the Alemanni of Germanism, and in fact their enmity was eventually settled with arms, and the Franks conquered the Alemanni under the Merovingians, and under Clovis, when Clovis was still pagan, by the way, and he converts because of the Battle of Tolbiac, where he exchanges his faith, his pagan belief for victory, and he converts to Christianity because eventually he won the battle. So he maintained the deal with the Christian God, and he converted not only himself but also the whole Frankish people to Christianity because of victory. But this happens later. The point now is that the Franks side with Rome against the Huns, and in fact we find the Frankish federati fighting alongside the Romans at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains against the Huns of Attila in 451. So the collapse of the western half of the empire allowed the Franks, however, at this point to expand. So this happened kind of 20 years later, and the main problem is that there was another. We'll see now. There was still a kind of a Roman administration there with the kingdom of Syagrius, but in general, the progressive collapse of the western half of the empire was, taken as a very good opportunity for the Franks to say, okay, let's keep expanding. So at this point, they were actually still relatively pro-Roman, but they needed to take their own land, their own space wherever they go. Now the Hunnic Empire had been destroyed as Attila died. The whole thing vanished quickly. So there are many events that allowed the Franks many routes of expansions as well, both in the west and in the east. So the at this point, the Franks also get decompressed fundamentally as a people from a geographical point of view, because by expanding over the territory, they give life to certain other kingdoms, some in the southwest of the Rhine. They create these kingdoms at the southwest of the Rhine. So in here they have this main distinction that starts taking place ideally. That is, the Franks of the west that are known as Sali or Salians, that occupy the Scheldt valley around Cambrai, Arras, Tournai, and Tongres. And then the Franks of the east, the so-known Ripuari, because they were closer to the Ripa, so that is the western bank of the Rhine. Even though the term Ripuari will actually appear in the Frankish sources only from the 8th century. So it was a conventional name that either was already conceived but not written. I mean, it was ideal, mostly geographically dictated, because in fact closer to the Rhine bank of the, and this other part instead settled into the region of the Moselle, close to Trier, Cologne, Mainz, and Metz. So these two kind of big chunks. The Merovingians stem from the Salians, renowningly enough, so the westernmost Franks, that are incidentally also, in fact, the kind of the most Romanized, at least given the places where they had settled, because they were in northeastern France roughly, and therefore to an area it was kind of more Roman, a little bit more than the area of the Rhine actually was, because the Ripuari actually still occupied lands that were across the Rhine into Germany. So it's in fact the Salian Franks with their king Clovis, that in the year 486 defeated close to Soissons this political military leader of Gallic origin, Syagrius, that had carved his own dominion in the area, and it was known, which was known in fact as the as Syagrius' kingdom. Syagrius actually fled from northern Gaul, and he took refuge in among the Visigoths. The Visigothic king Alaric II, that controlled at this point southern Gaul. You know that the Visigoths at this time mostly owned this area of Aquitaine, that eventually they are shifted by the same Frankish pressure into Spain. And Alaric II actually betrayed Syagrius, actually handing him to the Franks, who killed him very, very gently. The Syagrius at this point is a fascinating figure, because he's usually remembered as this continuator of the Roman government in Gaul. But he was de facto sort of demi-rebel to the empire in some way. Even if the institutional situation was rather complex at this time, it was still Julius Nepos, actually, who is the true last Roman emperor, was elected as such. Sometimes we say, oh well, no, it's Romulus Augustus who gets deposed in 476. Well, no, there is Nepos who lives on into Pannonia, and he dies kind of late. I don't remember when exactly, in 493, or maybe not. Let me check. However, that's all the various dates you can use to the no, 418 definitely, yes, it was earlier, that kind of lived on as the legitimate emperor of the West, by certain standards at least, that made the empire kind of continue. But this is not the point. The point is that fundamentally Siagrius is a typical political and military figure of the time. A military leader that was on the frontiers, or however in these faraway decentralized lands of the empire, on behalf of the empire, that find himself basically isolated out there on his own. He gets defeated by the Franks, and he lost in the kingdom and was killed. But this episode is definitely very, very, very important, because the Salian Franks at this point occupied this quite consistent chunk of Gaul that was represented by the kingdom of Siagrius, a kingdom that had maintained very firm Roman institutions. So this is particularly important for the history of eventually of the Merovingians, because it's a sort of paradox, if you want, because the Franks that had been relatively, superficially Romanized up to that point, differently at least from other Germans like the Goths, actually seized these territories, and they stressed as their prerogative the continuation of the imperial lawfulness of their rule, represented by the formal subjection to the only emperor that now had remained in charge, the one of Constantinople, Zeno, at the time. This is particularly important, because eventually Clovis will get fundamentally the purplish mantle and the vicariate of the Gauls by the same emperor, Zeno. So this was particularly meaningful for the imperialistic ambitions of the Merovingians, because they started believing fundamentally that they had come to rule over Gaul, where they eventually expand, kicking out even the Visigoths, the Battle of Vouillé, etc., on behalf of the empire. And that's where the Frankish Empire, ideologically speaking, starts to appear. Now, in the videos about Clovis, we explained how eventually Clovis rose to power, how all these transformations took place. But it's important to stress the Merovingian ideal of continuing the Roman rule into Gaul, because that was a legitimizing factor. The Merovingians used every single possible, imaginable tool to stress, to legitimize their own prerogatives, not only in the Frankish, within the Frankish people, but also internationally speaking. So that's how it began. And this is particularly fascinating in my opinion, because it is true, the Franks weren't quite Romanized. I mean, we sometimes think that as, being allies, that they were kind of Romanized in the sense they, they kind of started being like Romans, even in their lifestyle, their mindset. Of course not. These were Germans. They had a very, actually, especially the Franks had a very primitive mindset. Like, there is no comparison. The Goths were kind of way more advanced politically speaking. The Franks were pretty rough. I mean, they had literally come out of the forests a very short time before. And they still maintained, however, even in this, a kind of this helped. This helped them to maintain this kind of militaristic mindset, relatively even to their political legitimization over the Gauls, because they were probably some of the most burning believers in the divine legitimization of the military rule. This is particularly important. This is something I started talking about recently in my videos, that I think it's particularly useful to understand many things also about the Carolingian Empire, etc. That is, that the Franks truly believed that they, now, as we see, Clovis had Christianized the Franks, so theoretically now the Franks were Catholic, but actually their mindset was still very pagan. And in paganism there was the idea that the divine glory of the celestial deities of the sky would basically grant the virtue of command to whoever was worth it. So that command was not actually a human achievement, but a supernatural, a divine one, a divine concession that the celestial deity of the skies made to the brave commander. It's important that the Franks called themselves Franks as well. We have seen that meant frei, courageous, free, etc. So the celestial deity of the sky, even in the Roman Empire, had passed from being Jupiter Capitolinus, then to this Apolliniac, solar deities, to eventually the Christian god, and the Franks, and there was still a lot of ambiguity relatively to this, aside from the various heresies of the that existed into the empire at this point, but also the general pagan background was pretty much alive, and it was an hybrid now with Christian and pagan thing. So from a German perspective, the empire of the Romans was factually the true divine empire, because it was the largest one. The Franks, the Germans in general, knew that the Romans ruled literally everywhere. So now when they came to rule over the same Roman lands, they started saying, this is being given to us, to the deity of the sky. Doesn't matter whether it's still our pagan one of Woden, or whether it's the Christian god. We don't care. The most important thing now is that we got the empire, or whatever they called it, because also in here we don't really know. This is particularly meaningful, because in a world like, I don't know, the one of 5th century Gaul, 6th century Gaul, what do you think the general mindset of the average Frankish chieftain could really be? Because let's be honest about this. These were people who believed in the right of the winner to rule over the vanquished. That all their mindset revolved around from forever, fundamentally. So that's what they were thinking by seizing Gaul. And seizing, by the way, much more than Gaul. Clovis, we have seen it from Tournai. He seized the kingdom of Syagrius and starts expanding the Frankish kingdom like far beyond. He crushes the Alemanni, he crushes the Visigoths. From this kind of mindset, that meant that he was the chosen leader. He was the one that the deity of the sky had chosen for the military glory of the empire. And now, by acquiring also this legitimization from Constantinople to be the vicars of Gaul, the Merovingians started truly thinking that they were the elected dynasty, and that's what the Franks kept believing. The Carolingians back in the day truly thought, just like the Jews and the Romans, that they were the chosen people. Charlemagne was literally obsessed with the Old Testament. He believed he was David, he was Solomon. He believed that the Franks had been chosen by God to be the chosen people. And just like the Jews, that was the mindset. Of course, Clovis didn't know much of the Bible. Of course, Charlemagne did know much more than him about it. But the hybrid between the pagan and the Judeo-Christian ideal of kingship is at the base of the Frankish Empire. is that this empire goes beyond the legalistic sense that the Byzantines at one point were stressing by saying, we are the only true Roman Empire. Our emperors are the only ones that are legitimately invested by God also here to create, if they ever wanted other emperors. Who are you in the West who call themselves emperors? The Franks would have answered, we are emperors because God has given to us the right of command over these lands. Where's the empire in the West? In the West, we are the ones who rule. This was their mindset. And this is a hell of a... I don't know how this... It would be interesting. This would be a terribly fascinating PhD research. I'm giving you this idea. Looking at how this thought evolved, unfortunately, I think there is a very few about this in terms of sources, because we don't know essentially what the Merovingians thought, but I'm sure there is something still to write about this. I mean, how much this world really continued the imperial legacy from the pagan mindset. This was it for real, and how much, by the way, this is what I wanted to say. Sorry, is that how much the Clovis victories and this extremely fast expansion of the Franks at that point, at the end of the 5th and beginning of the 6th century, catalyzed the process of of dynastization of the Frankish monarchy, because, and also the creation of the Frankish monarchy in the first place, because as we have seen before Clovis, the Franks were all kind of scattered kingdoms. They weren't a unique people. So it's effectively Clovis that founds the Frankish kingdom and empire in the Merovingian dynasty, and that's it. And it remains till the very end. The Carolingians simply collect this legacy. But it would have been, in my opinion, very, very important for the Merovingian dynasty to, being victorious, to demonstrate the Franks that they were the chosen people that the pagan deity had wanted them to rule. So, and through this thing of the victory, because that's what sanctioned this right of rule, you can understand things like Christianization. I mean, do you think the Franks were happy that one day Clovis kind of literally came out on the balcony of his house and said, Franks, now you become Christian, and they all Christianized? Let's just leave aside the fact that it's a story, of course, and it's not how it really happened, but do you think that this was, they accepted just because, I don't know what, he was strong? Definitely Clovis surely had his own retinues, his own clientele. He was a great and talented military leader, but, is it enough to convert a whole people now? No. I think the fact that he had won the Battle of Tolbiac, incidentally, at that point, for which he had decided to convert to Christianity because he had made a deal with the Christian God for victory, was the effective legitimization of his rule in front of the other Franks. Of course, there was plenty of Franks that didn't accept this. They said, okay, who are you to ask us, such a thing? There is all the episode of the Vase of Soissons that happened before that I like to retell all the times, because when Clovis conquered Soissons, putting effectively an end to Siagrus' rule in there, he had his army had won all this great booty, a very wealthy one. So there was the Bishop of Soissons, the Bishop of Reims, that came there and said, there is this base. Now this is, I think, Gregory of Tours telling the story, so it's all in a Christian key fundamentally. This was a part of the liturgical furniture, the So, and there was a holy vase, and said to Clovis, very with great humility, said, okay, if it is possible, it would be important for our church to have this vase back. And Clovis, now you have to think that the loot among the Germans was given by right of conquest, so nobody could touch the loot. So Clovis, that however here is depicted as the he is still pagan, but evidently, according to the ecclesiastical perspective, that he was already feeling, this sense of, faith of this. He was already a great figure that was eventually to convert and for converting the whole Franks to Christianity, and he understood the piety of the bishop, and he said, okay, I'll see what I can do about it. And he then spoke to the rest of his Frankish of the Frankish leaders, actually, because at this time they were all acting kind of together. And he said, look, but Clovis was already the most prominent figure in there at this point, among also this local elite of the kingdom that he had created. And he said, if you find this vase, whoever got it, whoever looted it, please give it back. And what happens is that the guy who the vase was found, and the guy who hears this this request in front of Clovis himself and all the other Germanic rulers takes I think an axe and crushes into pieces the vase of Soissons. Now at this point there is ice cold silence, nobody speaks. It's like, oh wow, this was a freaking thing. So Clovis doesn't do anything at this point. He actually collects with great piety all the small pieces of the broken vase and collects them and takes them back to the bishop, so showing his good disposition towards him, and he's naturally very sorry about it. He wanted generally to give this vase back. And what happens is, after 1 year, so Clovis thinks this over for like 1 year. Just this hatred, because what that noble had done was an open challenge to him, to his leadership, saying, who are you to ask us, free Germanic warriors that we have bled into the fight for winning this loot, that this loot has to be given back? Who are you? This was the true Frankish mindset. This was the one that was completely, incompatible with what eventually the Merovingian dynasty was able to create, because everybody had to be equal. That's what the Franks had been used to. So the military that shift, then by crashing the vase, that said, you know what, you want this thing so much, I crash it to you, so nobody can have it. So this is very meaningful, because he didn't just say, I keep it for myself, don't bother me. Because he also would have been like kind of challenging Clovis to combat or something like that. He definitely crashes it. You like it so much, then it's crashed. So we lost it. Both us, the Franks, who have earned it with the right of arms, and the bishop wants his vase back. This damn Christian bishop that we are pagans, we don't like. So after 1 year, Clovis goes to this chieftain. He seizes his sword and throws it to the ground. Now, remind that the sword in the Germanic world was effectively the alter ego of the warrior. It was the symbol of his virility, of his manhood, and so on. So, just like that, the warrior, the chieftain, he kneels to take the sword back, and Clovis splits his skull open with an axe blow, and over the corpse says, "Just like the vase of Soissons." And this is kind of the best history ever, in my opinion. It's very meaningful, but because of the aside from the theatrical and scenographic thing of the poor guy, with his head open up like a cucumber, but this tells you what it meant. What the term. First of all, it tells you how the average Frankish chieftain would have reacted to this idea of having an overlord that was completely incompatible for him. But it also shows you the determination, and actually that is not shown in the story, but the savagery, the brutality, that the ferocity that Clovis actually used to wipe out eventually all the Frankish nobility. I mean, Clovis had killed so many people, and it was funny because at one point he was asked for an explanation, and he said that as an alibi that he was making a cruise over the Rhine on a boat while he had killed all the noble, etc. So just for saying also the cunning means through which this the creation of the Frankish kingdom was eventually carried out, there would be a lot more to tell about this, but I think that with this video we have explained, I think, a bit better what I meant by the concept of Romanization of the Franks. Because I think in the other videos I said often that the Franks were somewhat kind of more Romanized than, say, the Longobards. Well, this is kind of true, but by Romanizing we don't actually mean that the Franks were this great, Roman-like people. That no, absolutely not. Here the degree of Romanization has to be understood also for the other peoples, just through the kind of the willingness to be part of the Roman Empire. And effectively, even if if you take the Goths actually stayed into the empire for a long time. The Franks, I mean physically, territorially, the Franks didn't quite do that, because even if they were settled on the left bank of the Rhine by the Romans, they were still on this frontier area that the Romans had already abandoned. So this is important because those areas underwent a further Germanization during the Frankish presence. I don't think the Franks were many, even endemically speaking, but they went to settle into this area of northern France and Benelux, etc., that at that time was heavily depopulated. So even ethnically speaking, they had eventually an impact, because they kind of repopulated these areas by certain standards. And at that point, locally speaking, actually, and especially in today's France, fundamentally in the territories of the modern day state of France, they definitely heavily Romanized. Like Clovis created the empire effectively playing on the local bishops, with local clergy. That was very powerful at the time. There were cities. You see that even after that all these Frankish kingdoms in the formerly Roman territory had been established around these major cities of the Roman rule: Cambrai, Arras, Tournai, Tongres, Trier, Cologne, Mainz. I don't remember. Yeah, no, Mainz. I don't think it was really. Let me check. Well, also Metz. Metz also was important. Metz was to be in fact the birthplace of Arnulf of Metz, who was the one of the where the Arnulfingian dynasty that turned up into the Carolingians actually was. It was the Pepinid Arnulfingians were born because one of these Pepinids married the daughter of this bishop of Metz. So this is particularly important because there was some sort of Romanization involved in the process, but there was a very strong Germanic dimension added to it that probably in the case of the Franks, because this is the point I wanted to make, in its primitiveness, in its warlike mindset, fueled the imperialistic ambitions of the Franks. The Germanic world was a world where the victorious commander had to be followed, because he had the celestial glory in himself. So as long as he was winning, you had to follow him, and this probably greatly facilitated the creation of the Merovingian kingdom, because the Merovingians now were seen as something way more than just a normally, one of the various small Frankish kings. They effectively wiped them out, also with cunning ways like assassinations that were considered completely unloyal for the Germanic mindset that still was about the challenging the enemy to duel or face to face, etc. So Clovis uses every possible mean at this point to get it, but he also makes it through arms. So it's not surprising that after a battle like Tolbiac, when the Alemanni were effectively crushed, he could ask his own people to convert to Christianity, because that was fundamentally the request of the glorious leader, who on that occasion allegedly had also won because he had made a deal with the Christian God, which means that he didn't believe in the Christian God. He just exchanged it for one of the other pagan gods that existed. I mean, in a typical contractualistic fashion, but giving birth nevertheless to the Christianization of the Franks. It was kind of always weak, because if you look at what the Frankish clergy was at the time of the rise of the Carolingians, it's barely definable as a clergy. They couldn't even read Latin practically. So, well, aside especially the ones of of course the great Gallo-Roman / Frankish at this point, Gallic elites were well educated, but still they had gotten a bit rougher with the Frankish, the injection of this Germanic lifestyles in aristocratic model, because they were effectively now warriors themselves, even as bishops and so on. But so you see, so many things to tell that I wish we had more time for explaining, but that I hope are clear in some measure. This is particularly important because you can't understand the Franks otherwise. You can't understand why they got to that point. And the more time passes, the more I'm amazed by what Clovis did, because no other Germanic king was ever able to accomplish anything like that at that time. And that's why, in fact, the Franks remained, or at least became the kind of the strongest element, the strongest rule in the West, even though, we have seen by the 7th century they had consistently fragmented, they weren't much of a real power, but eventually the Carolingians basically rebuilt it from the same basis, and you can spot this continuity that eventually flows into the, to the Frankish monarchies of the High Middle Ages and of the Western culture and so on. So this had long historical implications, let's say, because just imagine that if Clovis had not existed, let's put it in this way, I mean the Franks probably would have remained something like, not really like the Anglo-Saxons, because that degree of fragmentation was already, with all these kings that we have seen in the Frankish world, was still something more unitary compared to what the Anglo-Saxon created eventually by that time. But there would have been the lack of a consistent monarch. Actually, I think that the Franks would have been way less structured as a monarchy than the Goths, and it's even well possible that at that point peoples like the Ostrogoths and so on would have expanded further into places like Gaul or the Alpine area by because the Franks would have been consistently weaker, being divided, not having this strong leadership posed by Clovis and his immediate successors that could, present a threat even for the Gothic or the Byzantine presence in the Mediterranean, etc. It would have been a completely different history that would have, by the way, gravitated increasingly more towards the Mediterranean rather than to Central Europe, probably, unless some other. But at this time, what these empires could do had counted time. I mean, the Franks were lucky to have Clovis, because eventually, as you know, by the 5th century, by the mid of the 6th century, there is this massive collapse of the late antique world. There is a brutal contraction of resources, etc. So all the resources, availability, demographic strength. So if the Franks had not carried this recompactation under a leader, a king and an emperor, effectively, which was not named as such, but de facto ruled over other peoples, they would have never had it for centuries at least, because by the mid-6th century the whole environmental system would have collapsed and there would have been no energy to create something more consistent. And at that point, who knows? Probably we would have had certain Mediterranean powers that would have expanded towards continental Europe and not the other way around, like it happened with the Carolingians, in fact. It's pretty interesting what if, but as you know, history is not made with if but with but. And maybe another thing the last thing I want to stress, that I stress also in the video of Clovis and the Franks, is think about the dual tradition that he had in his own very family. His father, a Roman federatus. So, definitely a Frankish chieftain, but de facto a Roman soldier. As in terms of international relations, also consider the far-ranging international relations that are entailed by being part of the Roman system compared to this local system of small kings. So all another world, a world that looks at the Mediterranean, that looks at this big empire, its military administration, its military traditions, its models of rule also, that in fact Clovis collected when he seized the kingdom of Syagris. It was heavily Romanized, and he maintains standing all these Roman institutions because he knows that they work. And he stresses also in here the continuity. He converts to Catholicism, not to Arianism, because he wants to be perfectly in line, politically speaking, with the local clergy, with the local institutions, with the local Romance populations that is largely Christian in Gaul at this time, at least in the cities where he in fact was to build the kingdom, in part at least as a general net of communications. The structure of Gaul in here was very, very important. The Franks had to thank that Gaul had remained relatively unravaged and still structurally standing as a Roman system that they basically seized without particular substantial modifications. From the other side, Clovis had his mother's model, the Thuringian one. The Thuringians were kind of the greatest propagators of Germanism, even when in fact Clovis expands the kingdom, he goes to crush the Thuringians as well. Ironically enough, even though he was half Thuringian himself, and the Thuringians, together with the Alemanni, together with this other pagan Germanic populations that dwelled into Central Europe, were allied with Ostrogothic Italy, because Ostrogothic Italy was not just a hell of a power in the Central Mediterranean, but it was still Arian. It was cooperating with the Romans, but not Romanizing, not accepting the full Romanization. I mean, if the Franks had been involved into a similar role, probably they would have still stressed their Germanic character. Let's not be so drastic in dividing the different orientations. The Franks were probably, even as we've seen, less kind of Romanized than the Goths. I have difficulties, maybe especially the Ostrogoths weren't definitely that Romanized. The most Romanized were definitely the Visigoths. The Ostrogoths had arrived relatively late into this area of Romania, had settled into the fringe of the empire, to the in the Illyricum. They were eventually sent to Italy. They had formed kind of in the Ukrainian steppe. They weren't that Romanized, but at least they had been coping with the empire more intensely, because they had settled as a whole people within the Roman boundaries. They were closer to the Byzantine Empire. They had an idea of empire that also was different. It was kind of more Byzantine than Latin, let's say. The relations at this time were sensibly varied on the basis of whether they happened. I mean, the Romano-Germanic relations between the west or the east. But so there was a choice that Clovis had to make. A choice whether, sticking to the traditionalist model or taking the next step for something greater than ever, that in fact he had the guts, the intelligence, the determination to pursue, changing forever the history of Europe, of the world, and creating, as I stated in that video, passing from Germany to empire, because that's fundamentally what happened in every sense, from a cultural point of view, from a political point of view, even from a territorial point of view. And that's a very overlooked turning point. We know it was gradual in many ways, but if you take it into historical perspective, at least for what Clovis did, it wasn't gradual at all. Because what happened with the Franks at that point, the creation of their kingdom, their expansion, etc., happened exclusively because of Clovis, because of the choice of that individual. And it's been tough, because for us, we say, okay, well, it's easy now in 2019 judging, oh, well, okay, I seize the kingdom of Syagrius, I wipe out all the competitors in the Frankish nobility, I slaughter who opposes me, I just use my force if I have it, create the empire. It's cool. It's much better than just being a small king in a small Gallic town, but the small Gallic city, at least Tournai, can be well. But you have to think about the cultural limit. The cultural boundary that existed now for carrying out this. It's a question of mindset. Nobody had ever thought anything like that before. You had a lot of enemies. You had a lot to struggle, a lot to risk. The life of these Germanic chieftains was usually brutal, short, and miserable in many ways. They could have been assassinated from a moment to another. This guy achieved, all this, even extending, not just creating a kingdom. That is the amazing thing, given the basis of the Franks that we have tried to explain today, but also and especially extend, not especially, but too, which is still a great thing, to extend his own rule over other peoples, over other areas, and this huge area of Europe, actually, from the Pyrenees to the Jutland Peninsula. It's kind of amazing. Or to the Scheldt River, to say better. But thinking about the dimension, it was, even if you look at it from a map, it's incredible. It's really incredible. Okay, when I talk about Franks, I get always carried away. And well, okay, for now, we will definitely keep talking about this sometime. Also, just always know that these are kind of general videos, generalistic videos. They do not really enter in detail. They just set the big picture. Then we will have to go in detail to all the stories one day if I will continue to do this, which I will, hopefully. However, for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.